Joe tried Chris's cell again. It rang for several seconds and went back to voicemail. It was 10 o'clock and they were supposed to have started filming at 9. He sighed. He felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He sat down in his bed, fully dressed, and contemplated his next plan of action. He's probably still asleep, thought Joe. He had to call Rich and GT back soon. They were waiting. He thought of driving to Christopher's house and knocking on the door. They had done that before, but Sean had been the prime mover of that encounter, and they had also been 17 at the time. Joseph felt he was too old for that kind of stuff now. He and his friends had been filming for 4 years, and he was exhausted at the amount of effort he had to put into getting them to show up. He looked at his recent calls. First it was GT. He had called at 8:30. Then Rich at 9. Joe reflected on Rich's thought process in calling at the exact time that they had planned to film. He let it go. It wasn't Rich's fault, he knew. He didn't even think he could blame Chris. He had no one to blame, in fact. He knew he wasn't going to drive to Christopher's house and knock on the door. He didn't have that personality. He considered calling Sean, but that thought entered and exited his brain in less than a heartbeat. Even if Sean did care enough to help, Joseph was just tired of having to force people to want to film. He understood why. The instant gratification of making something quality had gone out the window. Ever since they graduated high school, they were no longer surrounded by mobs of people coming up to them and telling them how good they were. Now it felt as if they made their films for their own sole enjoyment. At least that's what it felt like for Joseph. He couldn't speak for the others. He thought of the new guy Ray and the encounter he had with him yesterday. Those guys are our fans now. Joe didn't blame Chris, but he was disappointed. His phone rang. It was Rich. Joseph answered. "Hello?" Rich called into the phone. Joe took in a breath and focused on hiding the disappointment in his voice. "Hey, yeah, I called Chris 3 times. I'm pretty sure he's asleep. I say we give him another hour at the most and then we call it off and try to reschedule," he said. He felt like an idiot. Doesn't GT have work at 2? Rich asked. Joe frowned. "Yeah, I think we could get it done if we got to his house at 11, but I don't know if that's going to happen," he said. There was a silence over the phone. Then Rich said, "Okay, just call me, I guess." His voice sounded offensively indifferent. "Yeah, hopefully he calls me back soon," Joe said. "I'll call you if he does." "All right, talk to you later," Rich said and hung up the phone. Joe looked at his phone. He decided to text GT. "Doesn't look like it's going to happen today. Chris won't answer his phone, and I don't even think he will by 11. So we're probably going to have to reschedule." Joe looked at the text for a second, then added, "Sorry for the inconvenience." He sent it. He put his phone in his pocket and said, "Now fucking what?" as he laid his head down, feet still hanging off the bed. He knew filming was not going to happen today. He tried to shrug it off. He tried to look at the bright side. It was his first day off in 5 days, and now the whole day was open. Jennifer was out of the picture until later that evening, so the day was open to him. He could watch some more Mad Men, work on a script, go to the gym, go back to sleep. The last idea enticed him more than anything else. Sleep was always something Joseph could take more of. He was tired. GT had woken him up at 8:30. He had gone back to sleep for another 15 minutes before getting himself up at 8:45. By 9 o'clock, Joseph had the energy and the excitement that always accompanied him on film days, and he wasn't a morning person. By 10 o'clock, after calling Chris's phone 5 times and answering a multitude of texts and calls from Rich and GT, that energy was used up. He felt drained after only being awake for 1 hour. He kicked his shoes off and pulled himself closer to the head of the bed, his own head wriggling back and forth searching for the pillow. Finally he found it. He took his glasses off and began to close his eyes. The phone vibrated. His eyes started open. He grabbed his phone to see who it was. He dared not to hope to see Chris's name on the screen, if only he could be so restrained. His heart betrayed himself. It beat fast as a result of the small spurt of adrenaline that went through his body. A faucet had been turned on and he was running water. He looked at his phone. Someone walked over and turned off the faucet. Jennifer. "Good luck today on filming. What time am I seeing you again?" Joseph winced and repeated his mantra quietly in his head. "It's not her fault. It's not her fault. It's not her fault." He slowly laid his head back down. To prove to himself that he didn't hate her for this, he texted her back. "I'm going to call you around 6. I'll talk to you then." Joe closed his eyes again. Gym, food, writing, Mad Men. That sounded like the most he could make of a day off. And Jennifer. Joseph added her onto his list of things to attend to, then dozed off to sleep. Joseph stared at his computer screen. He was completely unhappy with his screenplay, and he had been since the second page. That was the beginning of the summer. Now he was on page 30, and he was just as unhappy as he was a month and a half ago. He drummed his fingers against his laptop and looked up at the ceiling. He couldn't understand what he was missing. There was a concept about screenplays that Joseph knew he had not yet discovered. No one had told him this, but somehow he knew there was something he did not know. He couldn't understand how he could write successful skits and short videos and not convert that success over to a full-length movie. This current script was his second attempt at a full screenplay. The first had been discarded after 30 pages. Now he was at that point again. He had the option of pressing on or... Joseph thought of the or for a moment. He smiled to himself. Or watching Mad Men. He frowned. He knew he would have to learn how to write screenplays sooner or later. He remembered the 2 books Professor Roberts had recommended to him. He couldn't remember the name of either one, not that it mattered. His professor could have given him the books, and Joseph would not have read them. He did not know why. Perhaps it was laziness, or perhaps it was something much worse. Joe shrugged and clicked out of his Celtics scriptwriting software. I'll come back to it, he promised himself. He wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. He clicked on his internet browser, and within a couple of strokes on the keyboard, the red home page of Netflix was staring at him from his computer screen. He figured he'd be able to get at least 2 episodes in by the time he had to see Jennifer. His mouse pointer hovered over the Mad Men icon. He clicked it. Cue the iconic music. He settled further into his bed, getting himself comfortable. His phone vibrated once, indicating a text. He blindly groped in the area that the vibration had come from. It was hidden amidst his sheets. In seconds he found it. Yo, totally my bad for today. I got promoted to head baker and they made me come in today to start. It definitely was not the plan. The text was sent from Chris. Joseph stared at it for a second, trying to determine exactly how he felt. At least he wasn't sleeping this whole time. Joseph tried to use that thought to console himself. He couldn't help but wonder, however, why Chris didn't notify him sooner. But Joseph knew that was just the way Chris was. There was nothing he could do about it. Mad Men's intro was ending. He texted his friend back. Congrats on the promotion, man. Yeah, it sucks that they made you come in today. We would have done some dope-ass filming. Do you have a new schedule? Don Draper's face was the opening shot. One hand held a phone to his ear. The other held a match. His face was screwed up in concentration as he multitasked, lighting his cigarette and cradling the phone. Chris texted back. I do have a new schedule. They're working on a concrete one, but as of now, all I know is I'm going to be working 5 to 6 days a week on the reg now. I'm a little pissed too, because when they offered me the job, I was of the understanding that it wouldn't change my schedule too much. They said I would have to work 6 to 2, but I don't know. I thought it would be only a couple days out of the week. Such is life, right? Joe nodded his head. He could see a coffin being sealed over his passion project. The Dana situation was dead. He felt guilty. Chris had just received a promotion. He was going to make more money and get more hours at work. Yet the first thing that he could think of was the fact that they would never, ever get another chance to film now. It was over. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He disliked it. Such is life. You're making more money, right? What's the increase in pay? Joe texted back. He debated pausing the show. He hadn't been paying attention. Don was talking to Peggy about something Joe could not understand the context of. Roger Sterling was talking casually into a phone. Joseph looked at the time. It was almost 5 o'clock. Chris said he finished work at 2. He shrugged that thought off. He shut his laptop up and got up and stretched. He wanted to get out of the house. He texted Jennifer. So you hungry? He waited for a couple of seconds. He stood standing in the middle of his room. He looked around. His shoes were laying at the foot of his bed. He stooped down to put them on. Jennifer did not text back. He sighed and called her number. It rang several times. Finally she answered. Hey, what's up? Jennifer asked into the phone. I know I said 6, but I'm done here. I haven't eaten since 1. Did you want to get some food in an hour or so? Joe asked. I was actually planning to take you out today. I was thinking of doing dinner and a movie. I really want to see the Bourne movie, Jennifer replied. You're trying to foot the bill for once? Joseph asked jokingly. Oh, shut up, Joe. I'm the girl. Girls get paid by their man. Tonight I want to pay for you. Where do you want to go? How about Capitol Grill? Joe asked. Very funny, Joseph. That's over my budget, Jennifer said, laughing into the phone. You're hoping I say Burger King, aren't you? Just admit it. Okay, since you're going to be difficult today, I'll pick. I can be at your house in 15 minutes if that works for you. The next movie starts at 5:40, so I think we'll be able to make it, Jennifer said. This is working out nicely, Joe thought. Okay, just call me when you're out front, he said. Okay, see you soon. Bye. Jennifer hung up the phone. Joe hung up the phone and went into the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror. He was wearing a yellow shirt that had a huge lion's face on the front of it. The lion wore glasses. He remembered the first time he wore the shirt in front of Jennifer. She made a joke and asked him if he thought the lion was him. She ended up regretting that. One thing Joseph did not tolerate was his girlfriend's making a joke at his expense. He sighed. In his head he referred to her as a girlfriend. As long as that word stays, he thought. As long as she didn't know what he was calling her in his own head, he'd be safe. He felt silly for being so stubborn about it, but he simply refused to give her the title. He hated what was attached to it. Things were good at the moment. He had her right where he wanted her. Granted, he was sure he couldn't allow himself to have sex with a random girl if it was offered to him, but Jennifer didn't know that, and she didn't need to know that. He saw her when he wanted to, and never felt bad about denying her. He figured he'd brush his teeth while he waited. He had been stagnant for most of the day, getting some fresh breath was the least he could do. He had already showered after the gym. He brushed his teeth quickly and rinsed out his mouth. He then headed up the stairs. His room was located in the basement of his house. He ran into his mother in the kitchen. She was washing dishes. Comical, Joe said to himself, though he made it loud enough for his mother to hear. What was that? His mother asked. Oh, nothing. I just think it's somewhat humorous to find you where you are right now, Joe said as a huge smirk spread across his face. His mother stopped her hands in the sink and looked at Joseph. She smiled. What are you getting at? She asked. Just women in the corners of the kitchen, washing dishes. It's a little cliché for my taste, but hey, to each his own, Joe said. Do you want to come over here and finish? Half of these dishes are yours, I'm pretty sure. Nah, I'm not really trying to be about that. Maybe in the future. Psych, Joe said, chuckling to himself. You're a real brat sometimes, his mother said, laughing along with Joe. So what are you up to? Are you headed out? Yeah, Jennifer's on her way to pick me up. She's treating me to dinner and a movie, Joe said. Uh-oh, what's the catch? You think there's a catch? She looked hard at Joe as if he had been stupid for asking the question. There's always a catch. Have you made her your girlfriend or whatever yet? No. Joe took a seat close to him at the table. She laughed again. So what do you call her? Joe shrugged. I call her girl, he said. His mother shook her head. I like Kirsten. It's a shame you two didn't work out. This one is much nicer, though. She's so polite. Joseph agreed with her. He was surprised to realize that the mention of Kirsten's name still sparked an emotion in him. It had been almost 5 months ago. She is very polite, he said. Well, just be careful. I'm sure you know what you're doing. Have you made up your mind about school yet? His mother asked. Yeah, I'm going to take the fall semester off and go back in the spring. I just don't know where yet. Basically, all the schools I applied to I got accepted. Drexel I might do, but I don't know yet. You could go there with your friend. Wasn't he applying to Drexel? He was not accepted, Joe said. His mother clucked her tongue. It's a shame none of your friends are as smart as you, she said in a joking manner. Yeah, it would have been cool to go to school with all 3 of them. But such is life, Joe said. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He saw that it was Jennifer and answered. I'm out front, she said into the phone. Okay, I'll be right out, he said. He looked at his mother and said, She's out front. What movie is it? His mother asked. Joe stood up and started walking away from her towards the front of the house. The Bourne Legacy, he said, and walked out the door. Jennifer's car was in front of the house just as she told him. He crossed the front of the car, opened the door, and slid himself into the passenger seat. Sup, girl, Joe said. Jennifer looked at Joseph in mild disgust. I hate when you call me that, she said. She leaned over and lightly slapped him on the shoulder. Wait, you're the one who doesn't like to be called girl? Oh, fuck, but I thought... Oh, fuck, I thought... Joe grabbed his head. What? What did you think? Jennifer sounded concerned. Joe felt bad for her. It was far too easy. No more jokes today, he told himself. Nothing, just this weird dream I had. Forget about it. So where are we going to eat? Jennifer stared at him for a moment and then started driving. Bertucci's, she said. Nice choice, Joe said sincerely. I really need to get gas. Do you think if I stop now we'll make it? Jennifer asked. Most likely. Worst case scenario, we miss out on the previews, Joe said. I like previews, Jennifer said. That's what IMDb is for, Joe said and patted the top of Jennifer's head in a condescending manner. She glared at him and returned to driving. I have to get gas, she repeated. That's fine, Joe said. He sat back in the car seat and got comfortable. The two drove together in silence. Joe looked out the window. It was a comfortable silence. At least that's what he thought. He looked over at Jennifer's face. He thought she looked fine. He knew he had a horrible tendency of getting under her skin. He decided to test the water. So did you have a nice day today? He asked. Yes. I spent it all by myself for once. Jillian spent the day in Philly with Edward, so I got to stay in my room all day and read, Jennifer said. Oh, yeah? Joseph was afraid to ask the follow-up question. What book are you reading? He readied himself for the blow. The Hunger Games, Jennifer replied casually. Joe turned his head toward the window and did his best to hide his face discreetly. That's cool, he managed to force that out of his mouth. Yeah, I really like it. Jillian gave it to me for my birthday, remember? Did you know they're making it a movie? Jennifer asked. I did know that, he replied. He thought about changing the subject. He wanted to. I think the girl from Winter's Bone is playing the main character, Jennifer said. Jennifer Lawrence, Joe tried to say as nicely as possible. Oh, I'm sorry that I'm not on that stupid movie site every day for 3 hours, Jennifer said. Joe chose to ignore the slight. Would you like to know a fun fact, Joe asked. Okay, she said. Both the book and the movie are essentially total rip-offs of this Japanese film called Battle Royale, which was made in 2000, Joe said. I highly doubt that, Jennifer said. Why bother doubting it if I know and you don't? Maybe you could just take my word for it. Joe was starting to get annoyed. He never understood when people questioned his knowledge of films. It wasn't enough that he was going to school for it, he was absolutely obsessed with it. Well, what happens in the Japanese movie? Jennifer asked. High school kids are chosen at random to fight to the death on an island, Joe said. Jennifer thought for a second as she kept her eyes on the road. I guess that sounds kind of like Hunger Games. Maybe a little, she said finally. Joe resumed staring out the window. He had learned not to bother. He chastised himself for even trying. Jennifer pulled into a Wawa gas station. She turned the car off and waited for someone to approach. Joseph recognized the attendant immediately as an old classmate, Jerry Pewter. Jennifer rolled down the window. Jillian or Jen? I always get you two mixed up, Jerry said, smiling. Jen. Can I get a fill-up regular, please? Jen asked. Jerry peered further into the car and recognized Joe. Joey! How you doing, man? Are you famous yet? Jerry said, his smile even bigger. Joe looked at Jerry. He had grown a beard since the two had graduated, but he still had the same doughy baby face. It made him look strange. The comment annoyed him. He's pumping gas and asking me if I'm famous yet, he thought to himself. The notion was almost too ironical to grasp. He knew if he said the wrong word or sentence, Jerry would sit there and talk to him about nothing for another 5 minutes, yet he had to say something. Nice beard, he said, trying to sound nice and uninterested at the same time. Jerry must have gotten the message. Thanks, man, he said. So you said you want to fill up regular, right? Jennifer nodded. The two sat in the car silently as they waited for Jerry to finish fueling the car. She paid him cash and turned the car back on. Well, I'll see you two later. Tell Richie boy I said hey, Jerry said. Joe nodded and waved as Jennifer drove off in the direction of the movie theater. I hate that kid, Joe said. Yeah, he's kind of annoying. Is he friends with Richard? Jennifer asked. I think so. Back in freshman year or something, Joe replied. A second passed. Richard traded up if you ask me, he added jokingly. Jennifer gave him a "you're so ridiculous sometimes" look and kept on driving. Within 15 minutes they were at the movie theater, Lowe's. They parked, went in, got their tickets, and sat down, all in the course of 5 minutes. The previews were just ending, meaning the whole trip was timed perfectly. As the movie started, Jennifer reached across the arm and found Joseph's left hand with her right. She locked her fingers into his and gave a short, tight squeeze. Joseph looked at her and she looked at him. He leaned over and gave her a short, tender kiss. Then they sat and watched the movie together. 135 minutes later, Joseph and Jennifer headed back to the car. I love eating after a movie. Just the knowledge that my hunger will soon be fed makes the movie so much more enjoyable, Joe said as he hopped into the passenger seat again. Joseph reached into Jennifer's glove compartment and pulled out her sister's sunglasses. He put them on over his own and said, "Next stop, Bertucci's, where the food is always piff." The restaurant wasn't far from the movies. They arrived no more than 10 minutes later. Joseph entered first and looked around at the interior. Jennifer walked up to the host stand and told the woman the guest number. Shortly, they were seated. I dig the interior. How about you? Joe asked as he grabbed a napkin off the table and put it on his lap. It's nice. What are you getting at? What are you getting? They have really good pizza. It's brick oven, Jennifer said, opening the menu. As opposed to stove oven? I never really understood the significance of brick oven. Like, I understand that back in the old country things were made with brick ovens, but just because Italian ancestors did it doesn't mean it was better. I don't know. What do I know? Joe shrugged. Jennifer looked at Joe and smiled. You're in a good mood, she said. I think you might be right, Joe said. I can tell when you're in a good mood. Your jokes aren't directed at me, Jennifer said. Joseph was about to respond, but a waitress showed up. Welcome to Bertucci's. My name is Miranda. Is this our first time here? She asked. No, it's not a first time here. Wait, unless you meant first time sitting at this particular table, Joe said. The waitress looked at him confused. He added, Don't mind me, I'm just an idiot. Can I get you two something to drink? Miranda asked, choosing to ignore Joseph's joke entirely. The couple both asked for water, and the waitress left. Joe looked at Jennifer. That was funny, right? It's not my fault that she's an idiot, right? Joe asked. Jennifer looked up from her menu. Her face showed annoyance. You know what I've noticed? Jennifer asked. What? Joe asked suspiciously. Whenever we have a hot waitress, you try to be funnier, Jennifer said, her eyes narrowing. Joe looked for Miranda, the waitress. She was heading back with the water. She was attractive, but Joe felt Jennifer was taking some liberties using the word hot. Here you go. Did you want some more time with the menus, or are you ready now? Miranda asked. I want more time, Joe said in a monotone voice. The waitress left. Was that unfunny enough for you? He asked Jennifer. She gave another glare. Whatever, Joey. Pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about. That's pretty easy to pretend since I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe if she was slightly above a 7, then we could have an argument about that, but she's more like a 6.5, Joe said. Are you seriously rating girls in front of me? Jennifer asked. This is going south again, Joe thought. Options ran through his head as to what response would be best to stop the snowball effect that was happening before his eyes. He decided on saying nothing. That worked sometimes. He kept his eyes on the menu and didn't look up until the waitress returned for their orders. Can I get the tomato and mozzarella pizza, please? Joe asked as he handed Miranda his menu. I'm going to get the same, Jennifer said. The waitress nodded in affirmation and excused herself yet again. Jennifer crossed her hands on the table and looked squarely at Joseph. Joseph smiled warmly at her. We're like the youngest couple here, Joe said, looking around the restaurant. Yeah, I suppose you're right, Jennifer said. The two sat together in silence for a moment. Joe took a sip of his water. Jennifer followed suit. I didn't ask you, did you like the movie? Jennifer asked. I did. I thought it was pretty good. I'm a fan of the Bourne movies. I was a little bit worried because this one is kind of a spin-off from the original series, but I like how they actually did it differently. Like Jeremy Renner's character wasn't a carbon copy of Matt Damon's. So yeah, I thought it was a good movie. Did you like it? Joe asked. I did. How did your filming go today? I forgot to ask, Jennifer said. Joe had to decide in a split second if he was going to lie about filming or tell the truth. He chose to take a chance. We didn't film today. Chris got promoted at work and they made him come in on his day off for training or something, he said. Jennifer looked at him for a second, taking care to comprehend exactly what he had just said. Finally, she said in an even tone, So what did you do all day? Joe scratched the back of his head. I got up at 9, called Chris for literally like an hour to no avail, went back to sleep at 10, woke up, did a quick 2-mile run around my block, hurt my knees, went home, showered, ate a pulled pork sandwich, and then I worked on a screenplay that I've been trying to write and watched Mad Men. Then I called you, and now we're here, Joe said. And did you have a nice day? Jennifer asked slowly. Yeah, Joe thought about it. It was as good as it could have been. I was really looking forward to filming, but we haven't for a month. I want to finish this project before it's too late, Joe said. When would it be too late? Joe shrugged. Well, Richie's making steps to go to college this semester, so I don't know where he's going to end up. Plus, Sean is going back to BCC, so his schedule is going to be a lot heavier. And now that Chris has a promotion, he's working 6 to 2, 5 to 6 days a week. Just the idea of trying to get him to do stuff on his only day off, Joe sighed. Needless to say, it's exhausting. Jennifer considered that for a moment, then reached across the table and laid her hand on Joe's forearm. I'm sorry to hear that, she said as she looked into Joe's eyes sincerely. He looked away. I'm fucking starving, he said. Later that night, after the dinner and the sex that accompanied it, the two lay in Joseph's bed. Jennifer was naked. Joe had his shirt and boxers on. Her head rested on Joe's chest. The two shared a nice, quiet moment together. Joe wished it was always like this, all the time, but he knew to savor the moment when it did happen. Her fingers stroked his arm slowly and methodically. He lay in bed and thought about the day that had just ended. Clips of the Bourne Legacy played through his mind. It wasn't a bad movie, Joe thought to himself. He grabbed his own phone that was lying on his right stand and texted Rich. You see that new Bourne flick yet? Joe texted. He remembered that Richie was a fan of the first 3. Joseph, Jennifer said quietly. Yeah? Joe replied. I can't sleep over tonight. Me, my mother, and my sister are all going out for breakfast in the morning. We're having a girls' day out, Jennifer said. That's fine. Joe didn't have a problem with that at all. The annoying part now was not being able to go to sleep until she was ready to leave. That usually took about 1 to 2 hours after sex. However, at that particular moment, Joe noticed how tired Jennifer looked. She might head home now so she doesn't fall asleep on the road, Joe thought hopefully. Joe couldn't see her face. It was facing his stomach, but her body seemed extremely relaxed. Her breathing was slow. Joe thought he might be right. Richard texted back. I haven't. You? Pretty solid movie. I don't think you'll be disappointed, Joe texted back to Rich. The room was still silent. Joe tenderly put his hand on Jennifer's shoulder and rested it there. Another text from Rich. I'm sure I'll peep in the coming days. Joe started to text back, but in that moment Jennifer turned her head and looked up at him. There were tears in her eyes. Joey, she said, wiping her eyes quickly. Can I ask you a question? Joe's heart sank. He prepared himself for the worst. Yeah, go ahead, he said calmly. The tears came flushing out of her. Why didn't you call me when you found out you weren't filming this morning? You knew I wanted to see you, Jennifer said in a breathless pant. Tears streamed down her eyes. Fuck. It was Joe's fault. He chose to tell the truth. He set himself up for this. He wondered why he did. He knew what Jennifer was capable of. He knew how sensitive she was. He didn't know why he hadn't just lied. He had done it before. Those trains of thoughts would all have to be addressed later, Joe told himself. In that moment, he had to stop a girl from crying. I knew I was going to be seeing you at 6. I figured you'd already made plans until then. That's all, Joe said sincerely. But why didn't you just tell me that it wasn't going to happen? Why couldn't you tell me? Jennifer asked. She was still crying. Joe's phone went off again. Rich had texted back. He let that go and focused on procuring more bullshit out of his brain to soothe Jennifer. I didn't see the point in telling you then if I knew I was going to see you at 6 anyway. And didn't I call you at 5 telling you I was ready? Joe said. Yes, but you obviously wanted to be alone, which is why you didn't ask me to come over earlier, Jennifer said angrily. I told you. I figured you would be already doing something. I would have called you if it was canceled yesterday, Joe said. Jennifer sniffled and looked searchingly into Joe's eyes. She rubbed her nose and said, You would have called? Joe wished he could roll his eyes at that moment, but he had to keep his face sincere. Sometimes he hated girls. Yeah, he said. If I knew we weren't filming last night, I would have told you. But I didn't find out until 10 this morning. I didn't see the point in messing up your plans. Jennifer sniffled again and dried her eyes with her hands. I didn't do anything today. I just waited for you to get done, she said. You read Hunger Games, didn't you? Joe said, trying to add some light into the situation. I could have read that with you, Jennifer said. Next time you will, okay? Joe said and kissed her on the forehead. Kiss on the forehead, he thought. That always seals the deal. Sure enough, she looked at Joseph with loving eyes. She said, okay, then stood up and started getting dressed. I really do need to get out of here. I'm really sorry for that. I just get emotional sometimes, Jennifer said hurriedly. She was noticeably embarrassed. Joseph felt sorry for her. It's fine, he said. Text me tomorrow about how the breakfast is. Joseph had an internal groan. He had just opened the door to a full day of texting from her. From 10 to 10, he imagined. Maybe it'll even start at 9, he winced. Okay, we're going to Denny's, Jennifer said. She was slipping into her shoes. Cool, Joe thought sarcastically. What came out of his mouth was, Sounds nice. I hope you have a good time. I'm sure I will. We haven't hung out, just the 3 of us, for a while. It should be fun. She was still sniffling. She slung her purse around her shoulder and walked over to Joe to kiss him a good night. He craned his neck forward while the rest of his body stayed stationary on the bed. He met her lips with his. Good night, she said after the kiss. Good night. You locked the door, right? He asked as he reached for his phone nonchalantly. Yes, she said, and she was headed up the stairs. Joe threw his head back against the pillow and sighed deeply. That was exhausting, he thought. The whole experience left a sour taste in his mouth. He liked Jennifer just fine. She was a willing sex participant and great company for a lot of other activities. He didn't mind spending time with her. That all included, Jennifer was extremely emotional, more so than any girl he'd ever encountered. It was a constant drain on Joseph. Every time she had one of her little episodes, he needed time to recharge before he could see her again, and she was going to text him all day tomorrow. He groaned lowly, taking care not to be too loud in case she was still in the house. He looked at his phone. Guy companionship always put him in a better mood. Richard texted him again. Every time I see the trailer, I can't help but laugh at Jeremy Renner's beard. It just looks weird on him, like it's fake or something, the text read. Joseph laughed to himself in his darkly lit room. He was already starting to feel better. He texted Richard back. You know who has a beard now? Joseph waited a moment for Richard to text back. He looked at the time. It was 1 o'clock. The TV was still on. He and Jen had been watching HBO movies for the past several hours. That was before the sex. His eyes had grown heavy. Still, Richard did not text back. Joe got tired of waiting. Fucking Jerry Pewter, he wrote. He looks like a clown, with a chin strap and everything. By the way, he says hi, LOL. Joe sent the text and closed his eyes. Richard. Richard looked at Joseph's text as he lay in bed. It was 2 weeks old. He couldn't remember the last time he had been up so early. His eyes could barely focus on reading what it said. Fucking Jerry Pewter. He looks like a clown, with a chin strap and everything, he read again. He didn't know why he was reading it. It was the last time he had spoken to Joe. He hadn't texted him back, he remembered that. He had fallen asleep. He scrolled up and looked at some more of the text conversation. This is stupid, Richard thought. He deleted all of it. Richard got out of bed and stretched. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The realization of what he was doing today came back to him slowly. His half-closed eyes changed to full alertness within seconds. He remembered the purpose of why he was up. He sat back down on the bed and shook his head of the cobwebs. He grabbed his phone that he had just previously discarded and scrolled through his list of contacts, stopping on Caleb. He called. "Hello?" Caleb's voice answered. "Hey man, I just woke up, so I have to shower and get dressed. All in all, I'll probably be at your place in 30 minutes. Works?" Richard asked. "Yeah, sounds good. See you then," Caleb replied and hung up the phone. Richard stood up and stretched again, this time shorter. He then headed to the bathroom to take a shower. He turned on the water and did a quick glance in the mirror. His face was already growing back the stubble he had shaved off the day before. He'd have to let it be. He didn't have the time to shave this morning. Instead, he undressed and got in the shower. Richard took cold showers. This particular time, however, he regretted it. The water hit his skin at all points, sticking out his hair from the goosebumps that were forming on his arms and legs. He grabbed his soap and washcloth and quickly began lathering his body in the hopes of getting out as quickly as possible. He splashed the cold water on his face multiple times, waking himself up even more. He wet his hair, rinsed his armpits of the accumulated soap, and turned off the shower. He stepped out and grabbed his towel. He dried his hair first, then the rest of his body. The whole process had taken less than 5 minutes. He was in his room, the towel wrapped around his waist, looking through his closet. He had already had an idea of what he was going to wear, a button-up with dark denim jeans. He just had to decide on the button-up. He grabbed a pale blue plaid and placed it on his bed. He took off his towel and reached in his drawer for a pair of boxer briefs. Next came the low-cut black socks, then the white undershirt. He grabbed his blue jeans from his closet and put them on. Finally, he put on the button-up and rolled up the sleeves to the bottom of his elbows. He walked back into the bathroom and grabbed his pomade, putting a generous amount into his hand. He pushed his hair to the left and slightly up. He took a comb and ran it through just to perfect the angle and uniformity. He washed his hands of the pomade and dried them in with a towel. He flipped the light off of his bathroom, walked back into his bedroom, and grabbed his tortoise-shell glasses off his dresser. He heard his parents stirring in their bedrooms across the hall. He hoped they wouldn't come out. A quick conversation with them would completely throw off his rhythm. Instead of waiting for his parents to come out and wish him luck, he headed downstairs, quickly and silently. He got to the front door and stepped into his blue carpenter shoes. He was now ready to pick up Caleb. It was 5:25. He was going to be about 5 minutes late. The car. He closed the door and buckled in his seatbelt, simultaneously igniting the engine with his right hand, and then he was off. He felt a wave of unanticipated excitement, which he thought he seemed a little premature. Still, he had to acknowledge it. He was moving forward. Finally. That's what it felt like. The feeling of being active after being inactive for so long. He was quietly excited, and it gave him more energy than the best coffee could. He was ready for the day, even as the sun came up. Within 9 minutes, he was pulling up to Caleb's house. 5:34. He was making great time. He texted Caleb and told him he was waiting outside for him. Caleb did not text back, but after 2 minutes he saw Caleb's form emerge from the large apartment complex. He was wearing a faded orange shirt, dark blue jeans, and brown loafers. He walked slowly and surely to the car, each step making his arms sway from propulsion. He nodded to Richard as he approached, his expression one of quiet relaxedness. He got into the passenger side of the car. "Hey man," he said. "Hey man," Richard said back. Then he started driving. It was silent in the car for several minutes. It was a comfortable silence. It was still very early in the morning. It was Richard who broke the silence. "Are you used to getting up this early?" he asked. "Not this early, but I try to get up around 9 every day. There's way too much stuff I have to do on a daily basis to afford getting up any later," Caleb said, still sounding tired. He took his hand and wiped at his right eye. "Yeah, I'm lucky if I get up at 11 nowadays," Richard said. "Consider it a good thing. One day you won't be able to." "Yeah, you're right. I just hate feeling like I'm not doing anything with my time," Richard said. He was pulling onto I-295. "Well, you're doing something today, man," Caleb said with a smile. Richard nodded his head in agreement. "I need a fucking shave," he said more to himself than Caleb. Caleb looked over at him. "Yeah, you're going to have to take care of that before it gets nice and scratchy," he said, laughing. "AKA, by tonight," Richard said mournfully. "Yeah, puberty sucks, man," Caleb said with a smile. The two were silent again for some time. "You know you're going to have to direct me, right? I have no idea where I'm going," Richard said. Caleb laughed. "I got it, man. It's really easy. You're going to get off at exit 65B, and the train station is literally right there. Do you know how to get to the new school at least?" Caleb asked sarcastically. It was Richard's turn to laugh. "Yes, I know how to get to the new school." Me and Sean actually went and scoped the place out last week, he said. You guys were in New York last week, Caleb asked. Yeah, just to find the place so I wouldn't be wandering around New York when I got there today, Richard said. Caleb chuckled again. So you guys went all the way to New York on a pre-run. Richard sniffed and squinted his eyes. I would call it a practice run more like, he quipped. Caleb shook his head and smiled. You guys paid for a train ticket and everything. Probably went down into the subway and looked at the maps. He couldn't contain his laughter. How was Sean? Was he helpful? He said with his smile huge on his face. Sean was helpful. I mean, he showed me how to get to the train from Trenton. He didn't know where he was going when he got to New York, but we got there. I'm not going to say it was solely thanks to him or anything, but he was a good presence to have, Richard finished. Aw, man, that's too funny. I wish I'd been there watching Sean with his puffed-out chest being kneaded. I can just imagine. His bravado must have been staggering. Richard laughed out loud, thinking of the memory. Caleb gave a pretty accurate description of him that day. His head snapping back and forth, looking at the street signs, trying to determine whether to turn left or right at the 34th Street. To his credit, he did get them there, but Sean had a tendency to be prouder of himself than anyone else could be. A fucking practice run, Caleb muttered to himself, still shaking his head. Any reason he isn't joining us today? Richard shrugged. Well, it said in the email that I could take one guest or parent. Plus, I'm pretty sure he works Fridays. Makes sense, Caleb said. Well, thanks for inviting me, man. I honestly don't go to New York often enough for my own satisfaction. I love excuses to go. Richard nodded his head and said, No problem, man. They neared their exit, 65B. Caleb reminded him, and Richard switched into the right lane. Caleb was correct. The train station was less than a mile away from the exit of 295. They pulled up to the parking garage, took a ticket, and parked. Richard grabbed his book bag from the back seat and did a quick check of its contents, a folder, notebook, and some pens. He looked at Caleb briefly and got out of the car. The waiting room was full of commuters. Caleb and Richard had no choice but to stand as they waited for the train that was 10 minutes away. Richard took a quick survey of all the people that were in the room. Many of them were in suits and ties of different colors, all holding an assortment of briefcases. He wondered to himself how many of these people were going straight to New York. Probably all of them, he thought to himself. He looked at the floor and kept one arm slung underneath his light book bag, securing it in place on his shoulder. 10 minutes passed and the train arrived. Tickets in hand, the two clambered onto the train in the midst of the white collars. You don't drink coffee, Richard said suddenly, more to himself than to Caleb. I do, I just don't drink it for the same reason other people drink it. I actually like the taste of coffee. I don't put sugar or cream in it. So when I drink it, there's no other purpose than that of enjoying the taste of it. I don't use it to wake myself up in the morning or anything like that, Caleb said. Richard nodded his head in understanding. He liked that about Caleb. For some reason he could not understand, he liked the fact that Caleb was not drinking coffee at that exact moment. Lots of people were. They walked to the back of the train looking for seats and past rows and rows of people with newspapers and coffee. Many of them had their cell phones out and were making calls with the important people in their significant individual lives. It bothered Richard, but it was something that he could ignore. Finally, they found a seat at the end of the third car they had gone through. They sat down and got as comfortable as they could. The last stop is New York, right? Richard asked, remembering Sean's instructions. Yep, Caleb answered. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. So are you excited, man? He asked. Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about it, Richard said. I love traveling, Caleb said, his eyes still shut. His body swayed back and forth slightly from the jostling of the train. Yeah? Where's the farthest you've gone? Richard asked. Not far enough. I think Florida, I would have to say. I have family members in Georgia and Florida. I haven't touched the West Coast at all, or any other country for that matter. I hope to in the future. I have to take Rachel to France in the future, so that'll be one place that I have to cross off the list. Girlfriend-boyfriend stuff, Richard asked. You could definitely say that, Caleb said, smiling. I don't know too much about that. The two sat together in silence for a while, the train periodically making its stops, letting passengers on and filling up the train. I went to Italy last summer. That was pretty cool, Richard said. Caleb's eyes were open. He looked at Richard. I vaguely remember hearing something about that from Sean or somebody. How was that? He asked. Don't you just love how we can talk about anything for the next 2 hours? Just from the fact that we're on this train allows us to sit here and feel free to talk about whatever we want, Richard said. You're happy to be moving towards something. I can understand that. And right now there's literally nothing more you can do to achieve your goal than being on this train right now, so you feel relaxed, Caleb said. Now tell me about Italy, so we can waste time before we get to your destination. Richard laughed and said, okay. He took a second to think about the memory. It was really nice. Definitely a good experience. What was the most memorable things about it? The food and the girls, probably. All the food I ate was ridiculously good. Like everything. Like, one specific memory I have was this mozzarella cheese. I sliced into it and it literally bled milk. Wow, that's impressive. So all the food was just incredibly fresh. Definitely. That was awesome. The places we went to were pretty awesome too. Venice, Rome, this little town called Spinette, all of which were quite amazing. That's cool, man. And the girls were attractive, you said? Holy shit, yeah. It almost hurt to see the amount of hot girls there. So many of them in sundresses and shit. Just the fucking sundresses and the tan skin. Literally, every place he went. Richard winced at the memory of all of them. Caleb chuckled. I can see it still pains you. Richard sighed. Yeah, it does. He thought of the girl he had met there, the Australian Italian. He almost laughed at the concept. He thought of her face and regretted it. It was almost a year ago. He sighed again. Richard looked at Caleb to see if he noticed it. I must come off so fucking moody sometimes, he thought to himself. He waited for Caleb to change the topic. He didn't. Was there any place in particular that had the most attractive girls? Caleb asked. Richard considered telling him about her. It doesn't solve anything, he nodded. This one memory pretty much encapsulates the ridiculousness of the whole thing. Me and my cousin were on a hike in these mountains, and we went through this path of trees that led to this old church really high up on the hills. This was near the place where my grandparents were from, Spinette. So we came to the clearing where the trees stopped abruptly, and we're looking up at this old church set on just like super green grass, and it was just ridiculously beautiful. Oh yeah, and there's even more hills as a backdrop to the church. It would have been an awesome place to film. Caleb listened intently. So we get to the church, and we hear singing come from it. Richard swallowed. And we entered, and it was getting to the end of Mass or something like that. All these people were there, even though the place looked uninhabited from the outside. At the altar was this chorus of girls looking like 17 and up in school uniforms leading everyone in the hymn. And every single one was just freaking gorgeous. All beautifully tanned skin. It was like a scene out of a movie. I could see that. That sounds great, man. It must have sucked to get back here and be exposed to the averages of America again, Caleb said. Richard nodded. Averages of America. Yeah, our average is a lot different than over there. It's kind of sad almost. Hell yeah, it's sad. You think I like walking on any given street and seeing pale, obese, white people just walking around? And the worst part is they look miserable while they're doing it. It'd be one thing if I was subjected to being surrounded by unattractive, overweight, happy people, but the actuality of the situation is that most of them aren't happy. Caleb thought for a moment, then added, It's hard not to get depressed about it. Richard laughed. I want a girlfriend, man. It slipped out. He had no clue where it came from. He hoped his face didn't show the alarm that was running through his head. He looked at Caleb with only a slight turn of his head, searching for a reaction. I can understand that, he said. Richard waited, but Caleb did nothing further. He sat back in his seat and breathed easy. He hated himself for that. That feeling of vulnerability he always got whenever he revealed a desire of his. He thanked Caleb in his head, reluctantly, for not pressing the matter further. Richard wondered if he knew that it came out as an accident. He wondered if Caleb was being mindful of that and was smart enough to not press the issue. He shooed the train of thought away. He was going to New York for his future college's orientation. This is the focus of the day, he thought to himself. This is what I focus on. Richard looked out the window. He could see that the day was starting. He pulled out his phone and went through his text messages. Everyone that he knew was asleep. He went on Facebook and read the list of notifications that the people he barely knew were posting. The few who had posted within the hour all made complaints about not wanting to be up so early in the morning. Some mentioned feeling good about the day. He snorted under his breath. If he was someone else, he would have made a status update, something along the lines of, going to New York for orientation, wish me luck. The notion disgusted him. He made a mental note to delete his Facebook when he got home and stuffed his phone in his pocket. I feel stupid for feeling like this is a big step, for like making this day significant, you know? But like, fuck, I can't believe how lucky it got, Richard said. Why do you feel lucky? Asked Caleb. I just totally fucked up my last semester at BCC. Just like really bad. I failed like 3 classes, I think, and the amount of lying I had to tell my parents to get away with it. It reminded me of when I was at Sacred Heart, Rich said. That was the Catholic school, right? Caleb asked. Yeah, I went there for elementary and middle school. And I'm gathering that you had bad grades? Richard grimaced. Holy shit, I was such a bad student. I was literally a piece of shit. The amount of lying that I had to do and get away with it. He shook his head in disgust. You seem pretty upset about it, Caleb said. It's just followed me this whole time. My parents caught me once and just figured I would never do it again for some reason. They didn't look at my report cards ever. I would just get them and hide them in my room, and they never asked to see them. They'd ask me how I'm doing, and I'd just say, fine, all my grades are good, and that'd be good enough for them. That's sort of interesting. That doesn't sound like a typical behavior of parents with an only child. What do you mean? Rich asked. Well, from what I've experienced and read, most parents of a single child have a much higher investment in the education and upbringing of that only child. I'm not saying that your parents didn't pay attention to you or anything like that. I have no idea what your childhood was like. I'm just saying it sounds like they weren't as interested in your schooling as the norm for your social class and standards, Caleb responded. I think they were just too trusting, man. They would ask me how my grades were, and I would lie and tell them I'm getting honor roll. And you know those bumper stickers that parents get? The one that says I'm a proud parent of an honor roll student or something like that. They would ask about how come they weren't getting that in the mail or whatever, and I would lie about that too. I'd tell them I have to pick it up from the office and that I kept forgetting. And then eventually they would just forget about it. And I was like 12 doing all this shit, and I'm still doing it. It's kind of strange to me that you're thinking about this now. I suppose it makes sense. Maybe what you're failing to understand or even admit is that you know what you're going to do, what you're going to have to do in the future. You never saw the point in getting good grades in school. Your parents told you to do it. You didn't. You lied about it. They never cared, so neither did you. You didn't see the difference between getting an A and an F, but now you do. You're finally going to school with a purpose in mind, a purpose that's completely your own. You have the support of everyone around you. So move forward. Do great in school. Do the extra things as well to get a job. Internships. Having your own film projects to show people, which is something we're already doing and won't stop doing. So just relax, man. Caleb smiled at the end of his little speech and patted Richard on the back. Richard looked at Caleb. He didn't know when it had happened, but right then he knew that Caleb was and would be, for the foreseeable future, his closest friend. He nodded his head and smiled. Are we fucking there yet? He asked. Caleb looked out of the taxi window. The two were silent as they sat in the back seat of the cab. There were dozens and dozens of people walking on the streets to the left and right of them, all of them different shapes and sizes. Fashion was everywhere. Men wore suits and polos and vests and watches and tight jeans and glasses and beards and bald heads. Richard looked at them. He was going to live here in just a month's time. He was going to be one of these people walking on the street. He wondered if he would fit in. He was confident that he would. Better than Joe, Chris, or Sean, he thought. He felt like this place was for him. He could finally blend in here. He wouldn't be the shortest guy on the street, or the most awkward, or the best dressed for that matter. He would blend in and be one of many. He would not stand out. Instead, he would add to the blur of faces and colors. His skin tingled with excitement. He hadn't felt excitement for anything in a long time. His life leading up to this point had been a series of indifferent experiences. He could almost feel the pull of so many hands, shoving and pushing him into places and situations he didn't care to be in. He knew that feeling would go away soon after he settled in here, in this city. Richard looked at Caleb. His friend's face was still looking out the window intently. New York is literally the greatest place to go for people watching. I fucking hate leaving here and coming back to Mount Holly. The contrast is a lesser word than disgusting, Caleb said. Severe? Richard asked. Severe works. The contrast is very severe. Thank you again for bringing me, Caleb said. Thank you again for coming, man, Richard said. Caleb looked over his shoulder and grinned at Richard. I told you. I'm willing to go wherever you want as long as I'm not driving, he said. This is it, the cab driver said as he pulled up to a corner. $16. Richard pulled out a 20 from his wallet and handed it to the cab driver. He waited for his change and got out of the car with Caleb following suit. The taxi pulled off, leaving the two alone on a corner of New York City. It was 12th Street. Richard recognized some of the buildings from his trip last week. He turned around and saw what he was looking for, the new school. It was a little ways away. So that's the new school. It's pretty new looking, Caleb said. You can say that again. That thing is newer than New York, Richard said. Caleb thought for a second, then said, I'm sure that couldn't be too hard a thing to accomplish. Richard shrugged and squinted his eyes. Maybe, he said, or maybe not. What time is it? Caleb asked. 8:45, Richard said. 15 minutes early, Caleb sounded impressed. I commend you on your punctuality. Thank you, sir. You want to head in? Richard asked. Caleb held his hands up. This is your show. I'm following your lead. I'm just an observer. Okay then, Richard said and started off towards the building. He looked up at the skyscrapers as he walked. It was strange. He had only been to New York a handful of times in his life, The idea of living there had never once occurred to him while he was in high school, yet when he was accepted into this college, the new school, he felt as if the idea to be there in New York had always been embedded somewhere within him. His feet walked forward with surety. He had no idea what was on the next street, over or across. He didn't even know how to get back to Penn Station. But in that moment, Richard was moving forward to the one destination that mattered, and he felt confident. His feet arrived at the entrance. He pulled open the door and allowed Caleb to enter. Richard followed him. In front of them was a long table that had 6 middle to young adults seated behind it. There was a short line filled with future students that led up to the table. Richard took a place at the end with Caleb. Caleb looked around the room. "I like the architecture," Caleb said. It was modern. White walls and naked pipes covered the ceiling. The room lived up to the school's name. Richard figured he would see a constant theme of that as his semester progressed. The line was moving relatively fast. People had already come in behind them, taking their places at the last in line. Richard took a quick look at the person behind him, a young girl that looked to be about 19. She wore a sleeveless white button-up with black suspenders attached to dark orange shorts. She wore fishnet stockings underneath the shorts. A jet black fedora covered the top of her blonde head. She wore black glasses, big frames. Richard thought of Sean and chuckled silently in his head. The girl was attractive. She had a skinny frame and a pretty face. He faced forward and considered her. He wondered how many times in the day he would stop and daydream about some girl walking on the street or one that he would meet in class. He was in fucking New York. He shut his eyes tight. It hadn't occurred to him. The girls had not occurred to him. He tried not to think about it, even though it had already entered his brain. He told himself he'd be fine, that he could handle it. Porn would be his salvation here, just as it was in Mount Holly. He looked at Caleb, searching for help. He had never seen someone look so consistently content in his life. Richard envied him. He wanted that. He wanted that contentment that Caleb seemed so easily to achieve. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, and he looked completely at ease, his facial expression soft and relaxed. Richard envied him. He hoped that he would get there, to that place. He hoped he would. They were next in line. "I can take you over here," called a male voice at the left end of the table. Richard and Caleb walked over to the man seated behind the table. One glance told Richard the guy was gay. His eyebrows had been waxed. "May I have your names, please?" he asked politely with a slight lisp. "Hey, my name is Richard Cosimo. He's my guest." Richard gestured towards Caleb. "I don't know if you want his name or not." "That's fine, thank you." The man looked through a stack of papers with a list of names. He found the C column and scrolled down the page using his finger as a marker. He found Cosimo and checked it off with a pen. Then the man grabbed a red folder. Emboldened in big white letters stood the college's name across the front, the new school. He handed the folder to Richard. "Okay, well, welcome to orientation. Inside that folder you'll find our itinerary for today. Basically, it's going to be exactly what the speakers are going to be going over with you. There's also a list of the school's rules and guidelines concerning living arrangements and class conduct. Other than that, you're all set. Just enter the door behind me and take a seat. Thank you." The gay man smiled at Richard and Caleb. "Thanks," Caleb said, and walked off to the door behind the man. The two entered into a large room filled with what looked to be about several hundred prospective students. Already Richard felt lost, and he had only just arrived. They stood in the place where they had entered, gathering it all in. There was a refreshments table equipped with Coke, Sprite, and cookies. Richard decided to head over there first. "They have cookies," Richard said to Caleb jokingly. Caleb laughed. "Does that mean we are going to go get some?" "I'm fucking starving. I haven't eaten all day," Rich said. "It's 9 o'clock, Caleb replied, smiling. Richard sniffed. "Duly noted. Still going to get some cookies, though." "You're welcome to join," he said. The two walked over to the stand. Richard grabbed a can of Coke and helped himself to one cookie. There was a person behind the table making sure no one overindulged themselves. It was an older woman. She smiled at Richard warmly and said, "Help yourself." Richard returned the smile. From the refreshments table, Richard made a quick survey of all the factions that were present. There was a big divide between the fashion majors and the film majors. It was as if the room were split into separate sections. On the left side stood the fashion and design majors. There were more of them than anyone else. The new school was most famous for their fashion program, after all. That side was multicultural. Asians, blacks, whites, Indians, and gays all stood and chatted amongst themselves about things Richard could not even fathom. The place was loud, like a cafeteria. For all he knew, the room was a cafeteria. That side must be where the fashion majors are, Caleb said with a smile. He had noticed too. Yeah, let's go to the other side, Rich said. Caleb laughed. I'd love to see your competition. The two headed over to the film and other miscellaneous majors side. They immersed themselves into the center of the group. Some were sitting amongst round tables, others were standing at the walls talking to each other. He noticed there were very few parents, though the invitation emphasized the students could bring them. Richard hadn't brought his own, and he felt he didn't need to bother asking why everyone else hadn't brought theirs. Richard found a table in the far corner and took a seat with Caleb. The two sat in silence and watched as more and more students filed into the room. It was past 9 o'clock. The proceedings would be starting soon. People seemed to understand that. Many of them hurried to claim their seats. A group of 4 guys came over to sit at Richard's table. Just you two, right? One of them said. He had a British accent. Richard almost laughed. Yeah, you can sit here, Rich said. All right, he said. The 4 sat down around Rich and Caleb. The one that had spoken to him sat closest to Rich. Caleb was on his left. The Brit was on his right. So what are you going for? What's your major? The Brit asked. I'm going to school for film. You? Richard said. Same. Good to meet you, mate. I'm Johnny. We'll probably run into each other this semester. Johnny extended his hand. Richard took it. How about you? Johnny nodded to Caleb. I'm just a guest, Caleb said with a relaxed smile. But my name is Caleb, all the same. Nice to meet you, Caleb, Johnny said, shaking his hand. Oh, geez, I'm ready to get this thing started. How about you? Richard nodded in agreement. I've never been a huge fan of orientation. All it is 5 or 6 different people telling you what to do and what not to do on campus. How many fucking times does someone have to tell me not to shit in a urinal? Richard asked. Johnny laughed loudly. He hit one of his friends on the arm, who was sitting across the table. Hey, he said to him, this one's funny. Richard smiled and said, thanks, man. Caleb was laughing too. He was looking at Richard intently. That made Rich uncomfortable. Caleb saw more things than most people. He wondered what he was thinking in that moment. There was a noise coming from the front of the room. Someone messing with the microphone. He was tapping it. Are we good? We're good? The voice went through the room. I think we're good. Okay, let's get started. First off, if you don't know where this is coming from, everyone please find a seat and direct your eyes to the front of the room, the voice said. It was a man. Rich searched for the origin of the voice and saw him standing at the front, holding up his hand high in the air, directing all attention towards him. Caleb leaned over to whisper in Rich's ear. It would honestly be hilarious if at some point during this whole presentation, shitting in the urinals was actually a valid topic that was addressed, he said. The two exchanged a quiet snigger and waited for the man to proceed. So, I'd like to welcome you all to orientation and more importantly enrollment in the new school, he said. Richard felt that came out a little awkward. He had finished with a flourish as if he had intended for there to be applause afterwards. There was none. All the same, the welcoming stirred something in Richard. He thought it was pride. My name is Dr. Jeremy Stockard. I'm the superintendent of this here's college. This may be the only time you see me, so get a good hard look, Jeremy said jokingly. Okay, so I'm going to give a short speech about what this college expects to give you and what we expect of you as students in return. Then we're going to divide you off into groups specific to your majors, and the heads of those departments are going to talk to you all separately. Sound good? The students murmured in agreement. Richard looked at Caleb. His eyes were fixed on the superintendent. He looked back at Dr. Stockard. The new school was founded with the sole principle of giving students like you the opportunity to perfect the craft. We are not a typical college. Our goal is to give each of you the luxury of being able to focus solely on the art that you have chosen and hopefully the one that you are passionate about. We want you to learn as much as you can about the things that you love without any distractions. There are no general education courses here. You're not required to take a math course if you're learning about dance. This school's goal is to free up your time to master something. Richard's heart beat faster when the superintendent said the word master. He felt silly, but he listened closer. What we expect from each of you is a dedication to your craft. You have come here because somewhere in your life you fell in love with the concept of creation. Whether that creation is expressed through fabric, cinematography, a brand new character, or animation, at the end, every single one of you is the same. This is the place where you will learn about the thing you love and you discover, hopefully, exactly how much you actually do love it. We want commitment in turn. We want drive. We want ambition. Ambition to be the best that you can be at the career you have chosen to pursue. More heart flutters. He looked down at his chest guiltily. His heart was betraying too much. You will learn, after you graduate, just how hard each of your respective industries are to find work in. The competition is very tough, but do not let that discourage you. We will give you the knowledge you need to be competent, and through that competency, you will find confidence. The confidence is essential. Accountants don't need confidence. Scientists don't need confidence, nor do doctors or lawyers or pharmacists. Confidence is required of those who plan to create. We hope to instill upon each and every one of you the level of confidence you need to go out into the world and do just that, create. So I thank you again for coming, and let's try this again. Welcome to the new school, Dr. Stockard exclaimed. This time he was met with applause. He seemed pleased with the response. Richard clapped along with everyone else. Caleb did so as well, though in a somewhat lackluster manner. He looked unimpressed. Okay, so let's get this nice and organized. I'd like to have all the students attending Parsons School for Fashion and Design to meet at the far left corner of the room, Dr. Stockard said into the microphone. Immediately there was movement. Hundreds of students stood up and began collecting their things. Film students and all affiliations will gather in the far right corner, he said. Richard felt a pat on his back. I think that means us, mate, Johnny said behind him. Many people around him were already standing up and heading over to the designated areas. Richard and Caleb followed suit, forgetting to pay attention to what the superintendent was still saying. What did you think of the speech? Richard asked Caleb. Caleb shrugged. I thought it was good up until he got to the confidence part. I'm not sure I agree with the fact that the professions he listed could be done without confidence. I accepted the first one, accountants, sort of grudgingly, but then he lost me after the next three. Apparently he's not aware that scientists and doctors create vaccines and cure diseases. You certainly don't need confidence for that. Oh yeah, and standing in front of a judge and jury pleading for a person's innocence can be done by the most timid people on earth, Caleb said mockingly. Richard laughed. I think he was just kind of getting into a role towards the end. I forgive him, Caleb sighed. You have that right, I suppose. He didn't say more on the topic. The two herded into a large group of people waiting for further instructions. There was constant chatter all around them. Richard listened in on the conversation held between two Jewish-looking kids. I don't even have to be here, really. My dad knows Woody Allen. As soon as I graduate, I'm getting a job in his production company. He already confirmed it, the one with the bigger nose said. I love Allen. He's my second favorite director. Bigelow comes in first, though. I'm waiting on more work from her, the smaller-nosed Jew said. Richard decided to tune out of the conversation. That was the type of thing that made his ears bleed figuratively. He was going to be surrounded with people like that. It was something he was going to have to get used to. He thought he was up for it. As long as he kept his head down and focused on his own stuff, he would never have to worry about what other people were doing. He didn't have to think of other film students as competition. He just wanted to be better than them and be recognized for it. If he could accomplish that, then he'd be happy. The thought made him excited. He anticipated the coming month. A woman had walked towards the group. She was in her early 50s. She faced the film students and said in a loud, clear voice, "Good morning, fellow film critics and movie lovers. My name is Miss Catherine. I'm the head of the film department. If you'll follow me, I'm going to take you on a tour through our section of the building, which is solely devoted to everything that involves the filming process." The woman beckoned the students to follow as she led them out from the large cafeteria and into a new hall. I want more cookies, Richard said discreetly to Caleb. Caleb laughed. When this is all done, let's get some food. A nice New York pizza, he said. Richard's stomach grumbled at the thought. Sounds like a plan to me.